whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
People say the Borgias, and the same images always appear: poison, scandals, secrets in Vatican corridors. But here's the twist. The most powerful weapon the Borgias ever wielded may not have been poison at all. It was reputation built, bought, and brutally manipulated in a Rome where the papacy wasn't just a church, but a state with taxes, soldiers, treaties, and enemies. And once faith and politics share the same throne, every rumor becomes ammunition, and every decision becomes a scandal. So before we repeat the juiciest stories, we're going to do something harder. Separate what can be supported from what was invented, exaggerated, or weaponized, because only then do the Borgias make sense. In the year when Rome's streets still carried the smell of horses, incense, wet stone, and expensive perfume, a visitor could stand on a bridge over the Tiber and feel two worlds colliding in the same breath. One world was ancient and spiritual, made of saints' names, pilgrim prayers, and the idea that the city was the beating heart of Christian unity. The other world was unmistakably human, made of bargaining, family alliances, armies on the march, and a kind of ambition so bright it could blind you. This is the world where the Borgias rise. And before we go any further, let's set the tone with one promise. We are not here to repeat the juiciest rumors just because they sound good. We are here to separate what can be reasonably supported from what was invented, exaggerated, or weaponized by enemies. That's the only way to understand why the Borgias became famous, why they became infamous, and why 5 centuries later we still argue about what they really were. If you enjoy this kind of history where we dig beneath the myth and follow the human motives that shaped the era, subscribe and come along. There are many families like the Borgias in the Renaissance, but few stories reveal so clearly how power, faith, and reputation can collide. Now, picture the Renaissance papacy as it actually functioned. To many modern ears, the word papacy sounds purely spiritual. But in the late 15th century, the papacy was also a state. It controlled land, collected taxes, minted coins, negotiated treaties, hired soldiers, and fought wars. The Pope could be a theologian, yes, but he could also be a prince. In fact, popes were expected to act like princes, because if they didn't, rival Italian powers would carve up the papal states like a feast. That reality alone explains why the Borgias could rise. It also explains why they could be attacked. When spiritual office becomes entangled with secular power, every moral flaw becomes political ammunition, and every political act becomes a moral scandal. The Borgias are often presented as the worst of the Renaissance papacy. Poisoning, murder, orgies, incest, secret rings, traps in the Vatican. The tale grows with every retelling, like a shadow that stretches longer at sunset. But the first question we must ask is not, were they monstrous? The first question is, who benefited from painting them as monsters? Because the Borgias were not merely a family, they were a foreign family at the center of Italian power. They came from Spain, from the region we associate with the Kingdom of Aragon, and their rise in Italy occurred at a time when Italy itself was not a unified nation. It was a fractured landscape of city-states and principalities. Milan, Venice, Florence, Naples, the Papal States, each with its own alliances and betrayals. In that world, outsiders were never simply outsiders. They were threats to local dynasties and local money. And if an outsider gains the papacy, every Italian rival suddenly has a strong incentive to destroy that outsider's reputation, because reputation is a weapon that can topple alliances, incite mobs, and justify war. To understand the Borgias, we must understand the machine they entered. Rome's politics ran through family networks. Popes promoted nephews and relatives, not only out of affection, but out of security. A pope without loyal family members in key positions was a pope at risk of being overthrown by the next conclave or bullied by the next coalition. Nepotism was common. It was expected. It was often criticized, but it was also the system. In this system, the Borgias were not unusual in the fact of family promotion. What made them unusual was the speed, the boldness, and the timing. They rose just as Italy became the stage for larger European powers, France and Spain, who would soon turn the peninsula into a battleground. The first Borgia pope was Alfonso de Borgia, who became Pope Callixtus III in 1455. He is not the most famous Borgia today, partly because modern stories focus on drama, and Callixtus was more of a traditional churchman. But he matters because he opened the door. Callixtus came from Spain and rose through ecclesiastical ranks with a reputation for administrative skill. When he became pope, he did what many popes did: he advanced relatives. He made his nephew Rodrigo de Borgia a cardinal. He also promoted another nephew. Critics later mocked this, suggesting that two nephews together might have equaled the maturity and experience of one worthy cardinal. Whether that jab is fair or not, it captures the tone of Renaissance cynicism. People were watching, people were judging. Callixtus also had major political concerns. One of his overriding fixations was the threat of the Ottoman Turks. Constantinople had fallen in 1453. Europe was shaken. Popes spoke of crusade. Callixtus tried to mobilize a campaign against the Ottomans, and he invested energy into that dream. He is also remembered for reopening the case of Joan of Arc and having her condemned verdict overturned, declaring her innocent, though of course it came long after her death. That act shows Callixtus as a pope aware of the power of moral correction, even when delayed. Still, Callixtus died after only a few years. The Borgia door remained open, but it was not yet a dynasty. That dynasty arrives with Rodrigo Borgia, who becomes Pope Alexander VI in 1492. Rodrigo is the gravitational center of the Borgia legend. If the Borgias are a storm, Rodrigo is the pressure system that creates it. Rodrigo was intelligent, skilled, and famously effective at administration. He held the powerful post of vice-chancellor of the church for many years, a role that gave him influence, income, and a network of obligations. He also accumulated wealth and lived with the sort of grandeur that critics would later describe as scandalous. Rodrigo was not celibate in the way the ideal of priesthood demanded. He had mistresses, he had children, he built family interests in a way that was both typical of Renaissance elites and deeply controversial for a pope. This is where modern listeners sometimes stumble. They imagine a pope as a purely spiritual figure, then hear about a pope with children and assume it must be uniquely monstrous. But the Renaissance papacy often looked more like a princely court than a monastery. Many popes had children, acknowledged or not. Many had mistresses. The Borgias became symbols of that reality, but they did not invent it. What they did do was thrive in it. In 1492, the conclave elected Rodrigo as pope. He took the name Alexander VI. The election itself became part of the scandal. Rival factions accused Rodrigo of buying votes through promises of offices and wealth. Some historians consider simony a plausible factor. Others note that conclaves were complex and that political bargaining was common. Either way, the charge of a bought papacy attached to Alexander like tar. It provided enemies with an easy story. He is illegitimate, therefore everything he does is corrupt. Now add the timing. 1492 was also the year Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. The European world was widening violently. Empires were about to be built, and Rome would be asked to bless, justify, or regulate this new world's exploitation. Under Alexander, the papacy issued bulls that affected Spain and Portugal's claims in the Americas. The most famous legacy here is the line of demarcation, a papal decision that attempted to divide newly encountered lands between Spanish and Portuguese spheres. In practice, this papal line intersected with diplomacy and power, and the later Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal formalized the division more specifically. The result, centuries later, is visible in language maps. Brazil speaking Portuguese, much of the rest of South America speaking Spanish. Alexander's role in this process made him a pope of global consequence, not only an Italian scandal figure. But this global consequence is morally heavy. The exploitation and enslavement of indigenous peoples in the New World is one of the darkest consequences of European expansion. Alexander's bulls and the broader system of conquest contributed to debates about conversion, sovereignty, and labor. Scholars argue about the exact degree of Alexander's responsibility, but it is fair to say that his papacy occurred at a moment when the door to colonial abuse was opening, and decisions made by powerful figures in Europe helped legitimize that opening. That is part of the real history, and it matters more than any rumor about secret poison rings. Still, the rumors persist because Rome itself, under Alexander, became a stage where every drama felt theatrical. Imagine the Vatican not as a quiet sanctuary, but as a court filled with ambassadors, petitioners, bankers, artists, soldiers, clerics, and spies. Italy was filled with professional diplomats who wrote letters like weapons, describing rival courts in the darkest possible colors. A rumor could travel from Rome to Venice to Milan in days, and by the time it arrived, it would have grown teeth. Alexander understood court politics. He used marriage alliances, he used appointments, he used the promise of favor, and he used his own family as instruments of policy. Here we meet the names that became legends: Cesare, Lucrezia, Giovanni, and others. Alexander had several children, some with his long-term mistress Vannozza dei Cattanei. Among them, Cesare Borgia stands out as the most famous, partly because he embodied the Renaissance blend of charisma, brutality, and strategic brilliance. Cesare began as a churchman. He became a cardinal, a sign that Alexander intended to place family inside ecclesiastical power. But Cesare's temperament was not built for a priestly life. He wanted action, command, and conquest. Over time, he would shed his clerical role and become a secular warlord, carving territory in central Italy. Giovanni Borgia, another son, was favored in a different way. He received titles and military roles. He represented the kind of family advancement that enraged critics, a pope granting secular power to relatives. Lucrezia Borgia, Alexander's daughter, became the centerpiece of the most sensational rumors. Many later stories depict her as a poisoner, an incest figure, a femme fatale of the Vatican. But when you examine the evidence, you find a more complicated and often more human figure, a young woman used as a political pawn in marriage alliances, then later, a capable noblewoman and patron in Ferrara. Her story is more tragic and less lurid than the legend suggests, and perhaps that is why the lurid legend replaced it. The Borgias also had other children, Geoffrey, who was used in marriage diplomacy, and others whose lives were entangled in the politics of the time. Alexander's family policy was not subtle. He wanted a dynasty, and that desire collided with the nature of papal rule. Popes did not establish hereditary dynasties in the way kings did. The papacy was elective. So a pope who wants a dynasty must build something quickly before he dies. That urgency can lead to aggressive moves. It can also lead to reckless moves. In Alexander's case, he moved quickly. But the Borgias were not operating in a vacuum. Their story is inseparable from the Italian Wars. In 1494, just 2 years after Alexander's election, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, claiming the Kingdom of Naples. This invasion shocked Italy. The peninsula's fragmented powers were suddenly facing a foreign army with modern artillery and the momentum of a major kingdom. The old balance of Italian diplomacy began to collapse. Alexander had to navigate this storm. He was pope, but he was also ruler of the Papal States. He had to protect Rome. He had to deal with France, Spain, Naples, Milan, Venice. In this context, Alexander's decisions were often driven by survival and advantage rather than spirituality. That is part of what later reformers like Martin Luther would condemn. To Luther and many critics, the Renaissance papacy looked like a worldly court, and Alexander VI became a symbol of that worldliness. At the same time, Alexander patronized the arts. This is another tension. Renaissance popes helped fund works that the world still treasures. Alexander is associated with the creation and decoration of the Borgia apartments in the Vatican, including frescoes by Pinturicchio. He also initiated plans connected to the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, a massive project that would later be tied to the financing strategies that provoked outrage and fed Reformation criticism. So here is the contradiction of the era: immense beauty and immense corruption, often financed by the same wealth. Now, in Florence, one voice rose against the opulence of Rome: Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a fiery Dominican preacher who condemned luxury, moral decay, and the worldly vanity of Renaissance culture. He criticized the papacy and the elite. He helped inspire the famous bonfire of the vanities, where citizens burned luxury items and art seen as corrupting. Savonarola's story intersects with Alexander's because it reveals the internal pressure within the church. The desire for reform did not begin with Luther. It was already there, inside Italy, in the form of preachers who felt that Rome's grandeur had become spiritually hollow. Alexander excommunicated Savonarola. Eventually, Savonarola was arrested, tried, and executed. This sequence became another piece of Alexander's dark reputation. Critics saw it as proof that the Pope crushed spiritual reform to protect corruption. Supporters saw it as suppression of a dangerous agitator. Either way, it shows how tightly politics and faith were tied. A sermon could threaten a regime, a pope could respond with legal and lethal power. While these larger storms raged, the Borgias pursued their own strategy, turned family into a territorial power. Cesare Borgia's transformation is one of the most dramatic in Renaissance history. He moved from cardinal to commander. He allied with France, gaining support for campaigns in Italy. He targeted the Romagna region, a patchwork of small lordships that could be conquered and consolidated into a more coherent state. Cesare used mercenaries, diplomacy, intimidation, and at times ruthless violence. He was effective. He was feared. Niccolò Machiavelli observed Cesare and later described him as a model of political skill, a man who understood the harsh realities of power and the need to act decisively. Machiavelli's admiration does not mean Cesare was morally admirable. It means Cesare demonstrated a kind of political competence that fascinated thinkers who were trying to understand how states actually work. Cesare's campaigns included the use of strong local enforcement. One of the most famous anecdotes involves his appointment of a harsh governor, Ramiro de Orco, to impose order. When the region was pacified, Cesare allegedly had Ramiro executed and displayed, signaling that cruelty had been punished, while ensuring the population feared the prince. The story may contain embellishment, but it captures the political theater of authority. Punish with one hand, reassure with the other, and always control the narrative. This is the Renaissance at its hardest edge. Now consider the rumors that cling to the Borgias: poison, murder, and incest. Poisoning was a common fear in Renaissance courts. Not because everyone poisoned everyone, but because the courts were places where sudden death could happen and could be profitable to someone. Disease, especially malaria and other fevers, killed regularly. But disease also provided cover for suspicion. If a wealthy rival died after a banquet, was it fever or poison? In a world without modern medicine, answers were ambiguous. That ambiguity fed rumor. The Borgias, being powerful and widely hated by certain factions, became ideal targets for poison stories. Tales of a secret poison called cantarella circulated. Stories described poison rings and poisoned wine. Some might be invented, some might be based on isolated events. Many were impossible to prove, but the rumor itself became a weapon. If you believe the Pope poisons people, then any alliance with him becomes morally suspect. If you believe his family murders for advantage, then every diplomatic move becomes sinister. As for incest rumors, especially those involving Lucrezia, the historical evidence is weak. Much of it comes from hostile sources and political propaganda. Lucrezia was a young woman placed into strategic marriages. She was surrounded by powerful men who used her name as a tool. In such a world, her reputation was not hers to control. If enemies wanted to accuse the Borgias of moral depravity, Lucrezia's gender made her a convenient symbol. A daughter in a powerful family often becomes the canvas on which rivals paint their darkest accusations. That does not mean Lucrezia lived in innocence or simplicity. She lived in a political environment where manipulation was normal. But the leap from political entanglement to lurid incest drama is a leap made by storytellers. So, what did Lucrezia's life actually look like? She was married 3 times. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, was a political alliance with the Sforza family of Milan. When the alliance became less useful, the marriage was annulled. The annulment was humiliating and became a source of scandal, and Giovanni Sforza fought back by spreading rumors about the Borgias, including the incest story. That alone should make us cautious. When a marriage is annulled for political convenience, the rejected spouse often retaliates with character assassination. In Renaissance Italy, character assassination could be more lethal than a blade. Lucrezia's second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, connected to Naples. This alliance later became inconvenient when Alexander and Cesare's politics shifted. Alfonso was attacked and killed, and while direct responsibility is debated, many contemporaries suspected Cesare. Whether Cesare ordered it or benefited from it, the event shows the brutality of alliance politics. Marriages were not romantic commitments, they were treaties. When treaties changed, the people inside them could be sacrificed. Lucrezia's third marriage was to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara. This marriage brought her into a court where she would spend much of her later life. In Ferrara, Lucrezia appears in sources as a duchess engaged in patronage, administration, and cultural life. She became a respected figure there, not merely a scandal symbol. She was not the cartoon poisoner of popular legend. She was, in many ways, a political survivor. Now, let's return to the Borgia's son who became a mystery, Giovanni. Giovanni Borgia was murdered in 1497, and his death became one of the great unsolved stories of the era. His body was found in the Tiber. Suspicion fell in many directions, including toward Cesare. Some believe Cesare envied Giovanni's favored status. Others pointed to rival families or political enemies. The truth remains uncertain, but the uncertainty itself fueled the Borgia myth machine. If a pope's son can be murdered in Rome, and the crime remains unresolved, it suggests a court where violence is close at hand, where secrets are thick, and where family itself may not be safe. In this sense, the Borgias were not only perpetrators in the stories, they were also trapped in the violent logic they helped build. When you play politics like a war, war eventually enters your home. Now, consider Alexander himself. What kind of pope was he as a leader? Alexander was energetic, administrative, and politically shrewd. He also embodied the moral criticisms of the Renaissance papacy. He used benefices, offices, and church revenue in ways that looked like financial engineering. He practiced nepotism aggressively. He maintained a courtly lifestyle. He was known to have sexual relationships. He had children openly acknowledged. At the same time, he also faced genuine geopolitical crises. He had to deal with foreign invasions and the survival of the Papal States. His policies were not purely personal indulgence. They were also statecraft. That does not excuse moral failures, but it complicates the portrait. It is possible for a leader to be both capable and corrupt. In fact, that combination is often what makes a figure historically consequential. Now, the Borgia story accelerates toward its climax with Cesare's rise and Alexander's death. As Cesare expanded power in central Italy, he relied heavily on his father's papal authority. Papal legitimacy could grant titles, authorize campaigns, and intimidate enemies. But that also created a vulnerability. What happens when the pope dies? The papacy is not hereditary. If Alexander dies, the entire foundation of Cesare's legitimacy is threatened. Cesare understood this. He moved with urgency to solidify territory, win allies, and prepare for the transition. But transitions in Rome were unpredictable. A new pope could reverse policies, confiscate titles, and ally with enemies. In 1503, Alexander VI died. Immediately, rumors erupted. Had he been poisoned by his own poison, intended for someone else? Had the Borgias accidentally consumed a poisoned wine? Had their enemies poisoned them? These stories were irresistible because they fit the legend. They also fit the Renaissance appetite for poetic justice. But medical historians often note that Rome was plagued by malaria and fevers. Sudden death was common. Alexander's death could easily have been caused by illness. The poisoning rumors may be propaganda, misunderstanding, or a dramatic narrative imposed on ambiguous reality. After Alexander's death, the Borgia position crumbled rapidly. A new pope, Pius III, was elected, but he lasted only weeks. Then Julius II was elected, a pope who was in many ways Alexander's opposite in factional politics, and who was also a determined enemy of the Borgias. Julius II, known later as the warrior pope, was willing to use military force directly and reposition alliances. Under Julius, the political climate in Rome became hostile to Cesare. Cesare tried to secure his position, but without Alexander's authority, he was vulnerable. He was arrested and later escaped. He ended up in Spain and then in the Kingdom of Navarre, serving as a military commander. In 1507, he died in battle, ambushed near Vienna. The man who had seemed capable of carving a new state out of Italy ended his life far from Rome, in the mud and steel of a battlefield. It is hard to imagine a more Renaissance ending: ambition, rise, brilliance, and then sudden collapse. If Cesare is the dramatic hero-villain of the Borgia story, Lucrezia is the human tragedy beneath the scandal, and Alexander is the patriarch whose choices unleashed forces he could not fully control. So why do we still talk about them? Partly because the Borgias sit at a crossroads where many themes meet: the Renaissance as cultural flowering and political ruthlessness, the papacy as sacred authority and worldly court, the dawn of European global expansion, and the moral crisis that would soon ignite Reformation movements across Europe. Alexander VI, in particular, became a symbol for later critics. Even though he died before Luther's Reformation began, the image of a corrupt Renaissance pope fed the moral outrage that made reform more plausible to many. When people believed the church's highest office could be held by a man rumored to be lustful, greedy, and politically manipulative, it became easier to believe the entire system needed correction. But there is also a darker reason we still talk about the Borgias. Their story is entertaining. It contains sex, power, betrayal, and violence. And entertainment often overwhelms nuance. A complex historical figure is harder to sell than a villain with a poison ring. That is why we must return again to the question of scapegoating. Were the Borgias uniquely bad? Or did they become the symbol onto which the era's sins were piled? The Renaissance papacy had multiple powerful families, the Medici, the Della Rovere, and others. Nepotism was widespread. Political maneuvering was normal. Luxury was common. If you remove the Borgias from history, you do not remove the moral crisis. You simply shift the spotlight to another family. This doesn't absolve the Borgias. It places them in context. They were intense participants in a broader system, and their foreign origin, their boldness, and their timing made them a perfect target for moral storytelling. Consider Julius II again. Julius was an enemy of the Borgias and helped dismantle their influence. Yet Julius himself was not a gentle spiritual shepherd in the modern sense. He led armies. He pursued territorial ambitions. He commissioned grand art, including commissioning Michelangelo for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He was in many ways also an embodiment of the Renaissance papacy's princely nature. The difference is that Julius's reputation, while complex, was not shaped into the same lurid legend of sexual depravity. Reputation is selective. Reputation is political. Now, what about the later Borgias? The family did not vanish. One of the most striking twists is that a later member, Francis Borgia, became a major figure in the Jesuit order and was canonized as a saint in the 17th century. Imagine the irony. A family remembered for corruption produces a saint who becomes a symbol of discipline and spiritual service. That alone should caution us against turning any dynasty into a single moral stereotype. Families are complicated, history is complicated, and there is another reason the Borgias fascinate us. Their story reveals how propaganda works. In Renaissance Italy, information traveled through letters, ambassadors, and rumor networks. Rival courts produced narratives designed to destroy opponents. Those narratives became chronicles. Those chronicles became history. And then centuries later, artists, novelists, and television writers used those narratives as raw material. By the time the story reaches modern entertainment, the distinction between rumor and evidence is almost gone. The myth becomes the default. So how do we rebuild a more honest picture? We start by seeing Alexander VI not as a cartoon demon but as a Renaissance prince in papal robes. That doesn't make him morally admirable, but it makes him historically understandable. He used power like a ruler. He used family like a political tool. He maintained a court like a monarch. He supported art and expanded influence. He also contributed to moral outrage and structural corruption. Both are true. We see Cesare Borgia not merely as a murderer but as a political innovator, a man whose tactics foreshadowed the modern logic of state building, while also embodying the brutality of that logic. He could stabilize regions by force. He could manipulate loyalty. He could terrorize and then claim to restore order. He impressed observers like Machiavelli precisely because he exposed the mechanics of power. We see Lucrezia Borgia not as a poisoner in a Gothic tale, but as a woman living inside a world where her body and name were political instruments. She endured humiliations. She navigated court expectations. She became a duchess in Ferrara and participated in cultural life. She had a complex inner life, as any human does, but history often refused to let her be human. It turned her into a symbol. And we see the Borgias as a whole, not as an isolated sickness, but as an extreme example of a wider system, a Renaissance papacy that had become entangled with statecraft and wealth in a way that provoked calls for reform. Now, let's walk through the Borgia era one more time, but this time with a focus on cause and effect rather than gossip. Step 1. An outsider family rises in a system where family networks matter. Callixtus III opens the door. Step 2. Rodrigo Borgia, skilled and ambitious, accumulates wealth and influence as vice-chancellor, then becomes Pope in 1492 amid accusations of simony. Step 3. Europe begins to expand globally. The New World becomes part of papal diplomacy, with consequences that echo for centuries. Step 4. Italy is invaded by France, and the peninsula becomes a battleground. The Pope must act like a prince to survive. Alexander does so. Step 5. Alexander uses his children as political instruments, securing marriages and titles. Step 6. Cesare becomes the engine of territorial ambition, using French support and papal legitimacy to conquer and consolidate. Step 7. Enemies respond with propaganda and opposition, and scandals multiply, some real, some exaggerated. Step 8. Alexander dies. The fragile dynasty collapses because the papacy is elective, and enemies seize the moment. Step 9. Cesare falls. Lucrezia survives into a different role. The legend expands. This is the skeleton of the story. On top of it, the myths grow like ivy. And now, we should address one of the myths that often anchors popular imagination. The idea that the Borgias hosted constant orgies and poisoned guests as casual entertainment. It is true that Alexander had sexual relationships and fathered children. That much is widely accepted. It is also plausible that the papal court contained behavior that today would be considered scandalous and morally unacceptable, especially for a spiritual leader. But the more elaborate stories, like regular orgies in papal apartments, are far harder to substantiate. They often appear in hostile accounts, later retellings, and sensationalized narratives. The problem is not that everything scandalous is automatically false. The problem is that in a propaganda environment, scandal becomes currency, and currency inflates. If you want to understand how inflation works, think of it this way. A rival writes, "The Pope has a mistress." That might be true. Another writer hears it and says, "The Pope is ruled by lust." Another says, "The Pope turns the Vatican into a brothel." Another says, "The Pope hosts orgies with nobles." 500 years later, a modern audience hears only the last version, and the earlier chain is forgotten. The original claim may have been partly true, but the final story has become a mythic monster. The Borgias are one of history's best examples of how that inflation happens. Now, none of this should soften the real moral problems. Even if the most lurid rumors are false, the core criticism remains. A pope with mistresses and children, using church wealth to elevate family, is a profound contradiction of spiritual ideal. It undermined trust. It fueled cynicism. It made reform voices louder. And the Borgias did not merely drift into that contradiction, they exploited it. So why didn't the system stop them? Because the system rewarded results. Popes were expected to protect the papal states. They were expected to manage alliances. They were expected to sponsor projects that glorified the church. They were expected to maintain Rome's status. Spiritual purity was preached, but power was practiced. In that gap between preached ideal and practiced reality, families like the Borgias thrived. Now, take a step back and look at the larger European scene again. While Rome is swirling with intrigue, Germany is murmuring with complaints about indulgences and church corruption. England will soon face its own break. France is uneasy. Spain is rising. The world is in motion. In such a world, the Borgias become more than a family story. They become a symbol of a turning point. The Renaissance papacy, at its most brilliant and most compromised, sits at the edge of the Reformation. That is why Luther's criticisms later could land with such force. People already believed corruption was real. They already believed Rome was worldly. They had heard stories. The Borgias gave those stories a face. And yet, it is worth repeating, the Borgias were not the only face. They were the face that stuck because it was dramatic. Now, let's bring the story home with the most human question of all. What does it cost to build power this way? For Alexander, it cost legitimacy. He may have held power, but many questioned his moral authority. For Cesare, it cost stability. His power depended on his father's life. When Alexander died, Cesare's world collapsed. For Lucrezia, it cost identity. Her name became a battlefield for others' narratives. And for Rome, it cost trust. When people see spiritual offices used for worldly ends, trust erodes. When trust erodes, reform becomes inevitable. That is the deeper story behind the myths. Now imagine, for a moment, a Roman citizen around 1500, not a cardinal, not an ambassador, just an ordinary person who watches processions and hears gossip. This person sees new art, new buildings, new splendor. The city looks magnificent. Pilgrims arrive, money flows. But the same person also hears that the Pope's children receive titles, that wars are fought, that taxes rise, that favors are bought. The citizen begins to feel that holiness and politics are tangled together like vines. Maybe the citizen shrugs. Maybe the citizen feels disgust. Maybe the citizen feels both at once. That emotional complexity is the Renaissance. And the Borgias, more than almost any family, embody it. So, when we finish the story and the last rumor fades, what remains? What remains is a lesson about how power behaves when it has both spiritual authority and worldly ambition. What remains is a reminder that reputations can be manufactured, and that propaganda can become truth if repeated long enough. What remains is a caution that systems shape people, and that people shape systems. And when both are flawed, the result can be spectacular and dangerous. The Borgias were not the only corrupt figures in Renaissance Rome. They were, however, masters of the system, and the system left fingerprints on everything they touched. That is why they still matter. Not because they were uniquely sinful, but because their story reveals the machinery of an age, a machinery that produced extraordinary art and extraordinary cruelty, a machinery that created global empires and global suffering, a machinery that dressed politics in sacred robes. And if we are honest, that machinery is not entirely gone. It takes different forms today, in different institutions, with different language. But the human hunger for power, the use of family networks, the weaponization of rumor, and the temptation to trade principle for advantage are not Renaissance inventions. They are human patterns. The Borgias simply lived those patterns on a stage bright enough to be remembered forever. To see the Borgias in motion, it helps to step into the conclave of 1492, not as a modern viewer looking for scandal, but as a political observer who understands what is at stake. The cardinals who entered that conclave were not monks escaping the world. Many were nobles, diplomats, administrators, men with households and clients, men who understood that the next pope would decide jobs, land disputes, and alliances that could decide life and death. A conclave could feel like an election, but it could also feel like a quiet coup. When Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Alexander VI, it was not simply because he had charm, he had relationships. He had proven himself useful to many, he had money, he had the ability to reward. And perhaps most importantly, he had the reputation of someone who knew how to make the machinery of Rome run. In a time of crisis, administrators often win. But the moment Alexander stepped into the papal role, he inherited the contradictions of that role. He had to speak as the head of Christendom while thinking like a ruler surrounded by threats. He had to preach moral authority while managing a court where morality was negotiable. And he had to protect the papal states, a territory that could not be defended by prayer alone. So, Alexander did what princes did. He built a coalition. Rome's factions were layered. There were old Roman families who saw the papacy as a source of their own advantage. There were Italian dynasties in Milan, Naples, and Florence who wanted a friendly pope. There were foreign powers, France and Spain, who wanted the pope to legitimize their claims. There were bankers, especially in places like Florence and Genoa, who cared about stability and repayment. And there were reform-minded voices, some within the church itself, who were increasingly horrified by the gap between spiritual ideal and political reality. Alexander had to manage all of them, and that meant he had to be a master of timing. When France marched into Italy, he could not simply condemn the invasion and expect it to stop. He had to calculate who would win and how to ensure Rome was not crushed in the process. For a time, he tried to position himself as a mediator, but mediation is never neutral. Every neutral decision benefits someone, and in Italy, every benefit creates an enemy. Now, as Alexander's papacy continued, he pursued something that would become the defining feature of his reputation: dynastic politics through his children. This was not only about love for family, it was also about security. A pope's reign is temporary. His enemies can wait, his policies can be reversed, his supporters can abandon him after his death. But if he can create a territorial baselands controlled by his family, then his family might survive after the papacy ends. Many Renaissance popes dreamed of this. Few pursued it as aggressively as Alexander did, and Cesare became the spear point. At first, Cesare's role as a cardinal made sense, Cardinals were power brokers. They could influence conclaves, they could manage territories, they could negotiate with kings. But Cesare wanted something else. He wanted command. He wanted the ability to ride out with banners and create facts on the ground. In other words, he wanted to build a state. This is where the Borgias begin to resemble the emerging logic of modern politics. A state is not simply a title. A state is territory, administration, taxes, and enforcement. It requires a monopoly on violence within its borders. The medieval world was full of fragmented lordships, where multiple powers claimed overlapping rights. Cesare's campaigns aimed to simplify that fragmentation by force. To do this, he needed legitimacy. Papal legitimacy could declare certain territories rightfully under papal control and could authorize campaigns as acts of order rather than conquest. French military support could provide manpower and strategic backing. Cesare used both. He became Duke of Valentinois through French favor and leveraged that title as part of his identity. This foreign-backed identity made him even more threatening to Italian rivals, because it suggested that the Borgias were not merely playing local games. They were plugged into Europe's largest power struggles. Cesare's campaigns in the Romagna are often described in cold political terms, but they were lived by real people. When a city fell, it wasn't only flags changing. It meant garrisons, requisitions, new taxes, and sometimes public executions to demonstrate authority. It meant local elites being replaced or forced to swear loyalty. It meant ordinary families wondering if the next army would be more brutal than the last. Cesare understood psychological warfare. He understood that a reputation for decisive cruelty could prevent resistance and save time. This is a grim lesson of power. Terror can be efficient. It can also breed hatred that waits for revenge. Machiavelli, who was sent as a diplomat from Florence, watched Cesare with fascination because Cesare embodied what Machiavelli suspected was true. Morality and power were not aligned in the way sermons claimed. To hold power, a ruler often had to do what was necessary, not what was ideal. Machiavelli did not necessarily celebrate this. He analyzed it. Cesare became one of his key examples because Cesare seemed to understand necessity. One of the most famous demonstrations of Cesare's ruthlessness occurred at Senigallia in late 1502. Several mercenary captains condottieri had become unreliable and threatening. These were professional soldiers who switched loyalties when convenient. They were valuable, but they were dangerous. Cesare invited them to meet, lured them into a trap, arrested them, and had some executed. This act sent a message. Betrayal would be answered swiftly, and Cesare would not be held hostage by mercenary whims. From a moral standpoint, it was brutal. From a strategic standpoint, it was effective. It is exactly the kind of incident that keeps the Borgia story alive, because it feels like a turning point where the old medieval freelance violence begins to be disciplined by state-building violence. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Alexander cultivated the image of magnificence. The papal court was not only political, it was theatrical. Ceremonies, receptions, and patronage mattered because they signaled stability and divine legitimacy. A pope who looked weak could invite invasion. A pope who looked splendid could intimidate rivals and impress allies. This is where the Borgia apartments and broader patronage come in. Alexander invested in art not simply as personal taste, but as political messaging. Art turned the Vatican into a statement. Rome is the center of the world, and the Pope is not a provincial bishop. He is a sovereign. But splendor requires money, and money in the Renaissance church was deeply controversial. Revenues came from church lands, offices, and various fees associated with ecclesiastical administration. Critics argued that spiritual goods were being treated like commodities. Reformers condemned the sale of offices. Ordinary believers resented the sense that holiness had a price tag. Alexander's court was therefore both a symbol of Renaissance brilliance and a trigger for moral disgust. Now, no Borgia portrait is complete without mentioning Julia Farnese, often described as Alexander's mistress. Julia's presence at court fed scandal narratives, but her story also reveals how women were woven into power structures. A mistress could become a conduit of influence for her family. In Julia's case, the Farnese family would later rise significantly, producing Pope Paul III. So even scandal can be part of long-term political ascent. Families used every available path to influence, and in a patriarchal court, A woman's proximity to power could become one of those paths, whether she wanted it or not. Still, the moral criticism remained. Enemies did not need to invent every scandal. There was enough real behavior to fuel outrage. The inventions simply made the outrage more dramatic. And that brings us to the most famous theatrical rumor of all, the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts, a tale of a scandalous event in the Vatican involving sexual spectacle. The story exists in later accounts and is widely repeated in popular retellings. But historians debate its reliability. It may reflect genuine depravity, or it may be exaggerated propaganda, or it may be a mixture. The safest way to treat such a story is neither to deny it with certainty nor to accept it as established fact. The point is that by Alexander's time, the papacy had accumulated such a reputation that people found these stories believable. Believability itself is a historical fact. It tells us how low trust had fallen. Now, if you want a concrete example of how enemies used scandal strategically, look at how Italian families fought. They used armies, yes, but they also used pamphlets, gossip, and diplomatic correspondence. A family could be weakened by being labeled immoral. A pope could be weakened by being labeled illegitimate. In a world where legitimacy mattered, rumor could be as damaging as cannon fire. So when we ask whether the Borgias poisoned people, we should also ask, who would repeat that story and why? Venice, for instance, was a republic with a sophisticated diplomatic network. Venetian envoys wrote detailed reports on Rome. Those reports included gossip. Because gossip was information, Florence's diplomats did the same. Milan's agents did the same. These letters were not always fair. They were tools. They were written to influence policy back home, to justify alliances, to warn of threats. Over time, such reports become sources for historians. The historian's job is to weigh them carefully, to recognize bias, and to cross-check claims. When you do that work, a more complex picture emerges. Alexander was corrupt in many ways, but he was also pragmatic. Cesare was ruthless, but he was also innovative. Lucrezia was entangled, but she was also capable. The Borgias were part of a system, and the system was full of similar behavior. The Borgias became famous because they were both extreme and symbolic. Now, consider Lucrezia again, but this time in Ferrara, where her legend often fades and her real life begins to appear more clearly. Ferrara was governed by the Este family, a sophisticated court known for cultural patronage. When Lucrezia arrived as Duchess, she was not entering as a free individual. She was entering as a political package, carrying the Borgia name, which could be both asset and liability. Some in Ferrara feared the Borgias. Others saw opportunity. Lucrezia had to navigate suspicion and expectation. Over time, she became involved in court administration, patronage of writers and artists, and the management of household and political correspondence. In a period when women's direct political power was limited, these roles were significant. They required intelligence, diplomacy, and emotional resilience. Lucrezia's later reputation in Ferrara was often more respectable than the scandals of her youth would suggest. That doesn't mean she lived a saintly life. It means she lived a human life within the constraints of her world. This is important because it reminds us that Borgia as a brand became stronger than the people themselves. Lucrezia, the person, was replaced by Lucrezia, the myth. Now, let's return to the collapse after Alexander's death, because the speed of that collapse reveals how fragile the Borgia project really was. Cesare had built territorial power, but he had not built a secure dynasty. He needed a friendly pope to confirm and protect his gains. He tried to influence the conclave after Alexander's death. He tried to position himself so that the next pope would be at least tolerable. For a moment, it seemed possible. Pius III was elected, and Cesare had influence. But Pius died quickly. Then, Julius II arrived, determined to dismantle Borgia power. In a sense, Julius II became the anti-Borgia narrative in action. He pushed to reclaim territory for the papacy and to expel foreign influence. He also pursued warlike policies, but framed them as restoration rather than dynastic ambition. He commissioned grand art, but framed it as church glory rather than family spectacle. Julius was not morally pure, but he understood the politics of image in a way that allowed him to appear more legitimate than the Borgias. This is another lesson. Sometimes the difference between infamy and acceptability is not the behavior itself, but the framing of the behavior. Cesare's final years are poignant because they show the limits of personal brilliance. He had skill, he had daring, he had fearsome reputation. But once the institutional support vanished, he was exposed. He ended up moving through prisons and negotiations, eventually dying as a commander in Navarre. It was a dramatic fall, and it fed the legend. The man who tried to become a prince in Italy dies far from the stage. And Alexander's death fed the legend too. Whether he died of fever or poison, his corpse became a symbol in stories, some describing grotesque physical changes, others describing divine punishment. These descriptions were often shaped by hostility and moralizing, but again, their existence matters. People wanted the story to end with a sign. They wanted the universe to comment on the papacy through Alexander's body. That desire shows how deeply people felt that a moral reckoning was needed. Now, after the Borgias fell from their peak, Europe did not become cleaner. The Reformation would soon explode. Wars of religion would shake the continent. The papacy would respond with its own reforms, including the Council of Trent and the rise of the Jesuits. And within that Catholic renewal, the Borgia name reappears in a surprising way through Francis Borgia, who became a Jesuit leader and was later canonized. His life stands as a counter-image: discipline, devotion, and service. It reminds us that a family's reputation is not destiny. So why does popular culture keep returning to Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia rather than to Francis? Because popular culture prefers heat to quiet, it prefers scandal to discipline, it prefers poison to prayer. Television series, novels, and games like Assassin's Creed have mined the Borgia era because it provides ready-made drama. Secret corridors, rival families, masked assassins, seduction, betrayal, and violence. Some of that drama is historically grounded. Much of it is theatrical, but it keeps the Borgias alive. And here is the final twist. The Borgias' greatest legacy may not be what they did. It may be what their story reveals about how history remembers. History does not remember fairly, it remembers vividly. A family that becomes a symbol can be reduced to a handful of images: the lustful pope, the ruthless son, the poisoned daughter. Once those images settle, they become almost impossible to remove. Even if evidence complicates them, the symbol becomes stronger than the archive. That is why we must keep returning to the core, to the proven and the plausible, and to the context that makes sense of the era. The proven and plausible is that Alexander VI was a worldly Renaissance pope who used power, money, and family to secure influence, and whose moral failures undermined trust. The proven and plausible is that Cesare Borgia was a capable and ruthless state builder who used violence strategically and depended heavily on papal support. The proven and plausible is that Lucrezia was a political pawn who later became a competent duchess and whose reputation was weaponized by enemies and storytellers. The context is that the Renaissance papacy was deeply political, and the Italian peninsula was a battlefield of states and empires. Reputation was a weapon. The Borgias were foreign outsiders who won the highest office. They were therefore attacked relentlessly, and their enemies' stories shaped their afterlife. If you hold these truths together, you can finally see the Borgias clearly, not as monsters in a Gothic tale, and not as misunderstood saints, but as human beings who climbed a ladder built from contradictions and then fell when the ladder shifted. And that, in the end, is why their story matters. It is not only about sin, it is about systems. It is about how spiritual institutions behave when they become territorial states. It is about how family loyalty becomes political strategy. It is about how propaganda becomes memory. It is about how beauty and brutality can grow from the same soil. When you hear Borgia, you are hearing the Renaissance itself, speaking in two voices at once. One voice praising brilliance, art, and ambition. The other voice warning that without moral restraint, ambition turns into corrosion. And if we listen carefully, the most honest conclusion is not a verdict but a question. If we had lived in Rome under Alexander VI, would we have recognized the danger as it grew? Would we have been seduced by the splendor? Would we have told ourselves that politics requires compromise and that holiness can wait? Or would we have felt the rot and demanded reform, even if reform meant tearing down the very institutions that gave the world its unity? That question haunted Europe in the early 1500s. It helped ignite the Reformation, and it still echoes today whenever power hides behind sacred language. The Borgias did not invent that echo, they amplified it.
Tonight's story comes to an end here. But the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments